Welcome to Should Have Known It, where we present 15-minute videos of things you definitely should have known. Hi, welcome to Shoulda Known It. I'm Ms. Aoki, and today's topic is Your Brain is Lying to You Right Now. We like to think of bias as something that happens to other people. The person who shares misleading articles. The manager who hired someone because they reminded him of himself. We spot bias in others with remarkable ease, and we use that spotting as proof that we ourselves are clear-eyed. That's not how any of this works. The three biases we're covering today, confirmation, anchoring, and availability, are not flaws in reasoning. They're features. They evolved because they were efficient. Your brain is not broken. It is doing exactly what it was optimized to do. The problem is that it was optimized for a world that no longer exists. So when researchers measure these biases, they don't find them in people with low intelligence or poor education. They find them everywhere, equally distributed, sometimes more pronounced in experts than in novices. The neuroscientist who studies bias has confirmation bias. The economist who studies anchoring gets anchored. This is not a comforting fact, but it is a clarifying one. Confirmation bias is the tendency to search for, notice, and remember information that supports what you already believe, and to discount, overlook, or forget information that doesn't. It was named formally by Peter Wason in 1960, after an experiment so simple it's almost insulting. Wason showed subjects a sequence of numbers, 2, 4, 6. He told them there was a rule governing the sequence, and their job was to figure out the rule by proposing their own number sequences. He would confirm or deny whether their sequences fit the rule. Most people immediately guessed even numbers or counting by 2, and then tested sequences that confirmed that guess 8, 10, 12. Yes. 14, 16, 18. Yes, they declared the rule. The actual rule was simply any ascending sequence. 1, 2, 3 would have worked. 5, 100, 101 would have worked. But almost nobody tested sequences that might have disproven their hypothesis because the mind doesn't naturally hunt for disconfirmation, it hunts for confirmation. Wason called this the 2-4-6 problem, and it has been replicated hundreds of times since. What makes this bite so hard in real life is that the information environment you live in is a confirmation machine. Every algorithm on every platform you use is optimized to show you content you will engage with, and you engage most with content that agrees with you or outrages you about people who disagree. The filter bubble isn't metaphorical, it's a mathematical expression of confirmation bias, automated and scaled. The practical move is not to try to think without bias. That's like trying to breathe without your brainstem. The move is to ask one specific question before you share something or decide something. What would I need to see for this to be wrong? Not, is this wrong, but what would prove it wrong? That question alone interrupts the confirmation loop. Not always, not permanently, but measurably. Anchoring is the tendency for the first number you encounter to set an invisible reference point that distorts all subsequent estimates and judgments. It was identified by Amos Tversky and Daniel Kahneman in 1974, in a study involving a spinning wheel rigged to land on either 10 or 65. Tversky and Kahneman asked subjects to watch the wheel spin, observe the number it landed on, and then estimate what percentage of African countries were in the United Nations. The groups that saw 65 gave estimates averaging 45%. The groups that saw 10 gave estimates averaging 25%. The wheel was random. The subjects knew the wheel was random. It didn't matter. The number contaminated the estimate anyway. This is one of the most replicated effects in all of psychology, and it scales into real money in remarkable ways. In a 2006 study, researchers had professional real estate agents evaluate a home and recommend a listing price. Half got a listing sheet with an inflated asking price embedded in the materials. Half got a deflated one. The agents with the high anchor recommended prices averaging $127,000 higher than the agents with the low anchor. Professional. Experienced, anchored. Salary negotiation is perhaps where anchoring is most consequential for most people's actual lives. Whoever states a number first sets the anchor, and the final outcome clusters around that anchor regardless of what's fair or market rate. This is why every negotiation coach alive will tell you to make the first offer if you can, and to make it specific, not round. $87,500 anchors harder than $90,000 because a precise number feels researched and the other party moves around it rather than dismissing it. There's a counterintuitive implication here. You can use anchoring intentionally, and you can also defend against it. Defense works like this: before you receive any number in a context that matters, generate your own estimate first, write it down. A number you've committed to in advance is a competing anchor. It doesn't neutralize the incoming anchor, but it blunts it. Judges who write down their own estimate before hearing a prosecutor's sentencing request give sentences that are measurably less influenced by that request. And the anchor doesn't have to be related to the thing being estimated to have an effect. Kahneman ran studies where subjects were asked to write down the last four digits of their social security number and then estimate the number of physicians in New York City. There was a statistically significant correlation between higher SSN digits and higher estimates. Completely unrelated number, the brain just reaches for whatever numerical context is available and uses it. The availability heuristic is the tendency to judge how probable something is based on how easily an example comes to mind. If you can quickly recall vivid cases of something happening, your brain concludes that it must happen often. If you can't easily recall examples, you assume it's rare. This is Tversky and Kahneman again, 1973, and it is arguably the one with the most direct influence on fear. Here is a pair of numbers. In the United States, roughly 40,000 people die in car crashes every year. Roughly 400 die in commercial airline crashes, in an average year closer to zero. But let's use 400 as a liberal estimate. Flying is, by any statistical measure, dramatically safer per mile traveled. And yet the majority of Americans report feeling more afraid of flying than of driving. The plane crash is available. It is vivid. It is covered obsessively when it happens. And the image is cinematic. The car crash happens on a Tuesday, on a state highway, and disappears from the news in 4 hours. After a major news story about a shark attack, calls to aquariums go up, beach visits go down, and searches for shark-related content spike for months. Meanwhile, in the United States, you are statistically more likely to be killed by a vending machine falling on you than by a shark. Not more likely to be injured, more likely to die. The vending machine never makes the news. The shark always makes the news. This is the mechanism behind why people dramatically overestimate the frequency of plane crashes, terrorist attacks, and child abductions by strangers, all of which receive massive, repeated, emotionally intense coverage, and dramatically underestimate the frequency of deaths from heart disease, falls in the home, and medical errors, which collectively kill orders of magnitude more people but receive almost no vivid narrative coverage. The availability heuristic also warps personal risk assessment in a different direction. After a close friend has a heart attack, you're significantly more likely to get a checkup, change your diet, and exercise, even if nothing about your own health profile has changed. The availability of that example shifts your sense of your own vulnerability. A cardiologist would tell you your risk was the same before the call as after it, but the call made the risk available, so now it feels real. Tversky and Kahneman's original framing was precise. You're using ease of recall as a proxy for frequency. That proxy is useful in a stable environment where vivid examples really are more common things. It breaks down in a media environment that selects specifically for the vivid, the dramatic, and the rare. The environment hacks the heuristic. These three don't operate in isolation. They interact, and their interactions are more insidious than any one alone. Availability feeds confirmation bias. The examples that come to mind most easily are the ones you've been exposed to most, which skews toward information that already matches your worldview. Then, confirmation bias makes you more likely to engage with content that makes those examples more available. It is a loop with no natural exit. Anchoring and availability interact in negotiations and in public policy debates. The first number floated in a political debate, the projected cost of a program, the number of people affected, functions as an anchor. And that number's power is amplified if it's attached to a vivid story. $1 billion anchors weekly. $1 billion. The cost of covering treatment for 200,000 families anchors much harder because it makes 200,000 families available. This is not a cynical observation. It is a structural one. Advocates for good causes use this because it works. Advocates for bad causes use it because it works. The mechanism doesn't care about the cause, which means consuming any persuasive communication, political, commercial, journalistic, requires watching for all three simultaneously. What are they showing me that confirms something I already believe? What number did they float first? What vivid story are they using to make a frequency claim? I want to be honest with you about something, because the internet has a bad habit of making this sound easier than it is. There is a version of this lesson that ends with, "Now that you know the names, you'll catch yourself." That version is wrong. In 2012, a team at the University of Waterloo published research showing that high need for cognition individuals, people who actively enjoy thinking, showed the same susceptibility to anchoring as everyone else. Knowing the name of a bias in a classroom does not inoculate you in the moment. What the research does support is a more modest claim. Structured processes reduce bias more than awareness alone. Premortems, where you assume a decision has failed and work backwards to identify why, reduce confirmation bias by forcing you to actively generate disconfirming evidence. Reference class forecasting, where you look at base rates before constructing your own estimate, blunts anchoring. Deliberate exposure to counter narratives, especially dull statistical ones, chips away at availability, distortions over time. None of these are things you can do in real time during a fast conversation. They require slow, deliberate thought, what Kahneman calls System 2, applied in advance or in reflection after the fact. Which means the practical value of knowing these three biases is not in the moment. It is in designing the conditions around your decisions, which information you seek before deciding, which advisors you choose who will disagree with you, which numbers you generate before you walk into a room. And yet, and here's where I want to push back slightly on the pure pessimism. The fraction of a second does matter. Not because it cures anything, but because recognition is a precondition for anything else happening at all. If you have never once considered that your reading of a situation might be confirmation bias at work, you will never in your life take the extra step. If you have considered it, sometimes, maybe 15% of the time, you will pause long enough to ask one better question. 15% of the time, over a lifetime of decisions, 15% is an enormous number. Think about the decisions that have shaped your life, the jobs you took, the people you trusted, the risks you did or didn't take. If 15% of those had one extra question asked before the final call, you would be, in a meaningful sense, a different person standing in a different place. That is what behavioral economists mean when they say that small interventions compound. It's not that one unanchored negotiation changes your life, it's that one unanchored negotiation leads to a better deal, which leads to more resources, which leads to slightly better options, which, 10 years later, compounded, is a dramatically different trajectory. The bias doesn't disappear, but neither does the intervention. So let me make this concrete. 3 tools, 1 per bias. For confirmation bias, before you share anything or decide anything with real stakes, ask yourself what evidence would change your mind. Not rhetorically, actually. Write it down if the decision matters. If you can't name what would change your mind, you're not reasoning, you're defending. Or anchoring, generate your own number before you walk into any negotiation, pricing conversation, or estimation context. It doesn't have to be right, it has to exist before the other number arrives. A pre existing anchor is a partial defense against an incoming one. And when you're on the receiving end of a dramatic first number, give yourself a beat. Say you need to check something before you respond. The anchoring effect is strongest in the first 30 seconds. For availability, when you're assessing risk or frequency, ask yourself, is this thing being presented to me because it is common or because it is vivid? Those are different questions and they have different answers more often than you'd think. Vivid and common are not correlated, they're almost the opposite. Genuinely common things are often boring, which is why they don't make the news, which is why they don't feel real, which is why you underestimate them. Here's what I actually want you to walk away with. Not the names, not the experiments. The fact that your brain has these tendencies is not a reason for self-criticism or for paralysis. It is a reason for humility, specifically the kind of humility that makes you a better colleague, a better decision maker, and a better thinker. The person who says, I might be seeing this through a lens, is not weaker than the person who is certain. They are stronger. Certainty without interrogation is just bias that's gotten comfortable. Tversky and Kahneman spent decades studying these effects, and Kahneman, who won the Nobel Prize in economics for this work, was famously candid about his own susceptibility to the very biases he named. He wrote in Thinking, Fast and Slow that he noticed his own systematic errors continue even after he'd spent 40 years documenting them. He didn't write that as a confession of defeat. He wrote it as a description of what it means to be human, and as a reminder that the goal is not perfection. The goal is one question you wouldn't have asked before. That's the fraction of a second. One question you wouldn't have asked before. Go find it. And that brings us to the end. Thank you for joining me and learning something new. Until next time, click like and subscribe.